Zenless has an antagonist problem and we all know it. Let's talk about it. Let's start with the basics. The problem is that none of the antagonists have any meaningful impact on the story. A common criticism of Zenless' story is that it lacks stakes, and a lot of that problem stems from the fact that Zenless doesn't have any interesting long-term antagonists. They exist for a patch or maybe two, and are written out of the story. Because of how quickly they get defeated, there isn't enough time to develop the antagonist properly. I'm going to explain what I think makes a good antagonist and why it's important. Nothing in a story moves forward without conflict. Let's say you're getting milk at a grocery store and some jerk named Ollie doesn't let you into the store. Ollie is your antagonist and this creates conflict. Without conflict, there isn't a story, or at least not a good one. Now that Ollie's in your way, what are you gonna do about it? A good antagonist forces the protagonist to act and make decisions, and we want our protagonist to make decisions. When the protagonist makes active choices, we get to see who they are and what makes them tick. When the antagonists are strong, the protagonist has to go through a change, and as an audience, that's interesting to see. So, what qualifies for a good antagonist? What makes a good antagonist usually depends on the story that's being told. Good writing is more about principles rather than following a formula. However, there is one thing that every antagonist needs, which is that they need to feel like a threat to the protagonist. If an antagonist doesn't feel like a threat, then they aren't an antagonist, they're just a traffic cone. They're a bowling pin meant to get knocked down, and that's boring. It means that there's zero tension, and that makes the stakes feel pointless. If we already feel like we know the outcome, why should we care? And it's not just physical, it's also mental and ideological, because having two opposed perspectives is also a good source of conflict. A character like Light Yagami is more interesting because he has L as a counterpoint. Seeing these two characters fight for their view of justice is what made that first arc of Death Note so interesting. If your protagonist is a force of justice, it's interesting to see when they fight against something that represents injustice or something more complex like tyranny. So how does this all apply to Zenless Zone Zero? Well, let's look at what Bell and Wise want. To Hoyo's credit, this is something that they got right. The Faith siblings do have a clear motivation. They want to discover the truth about the fall of the old capital and clear their mentor's name. Bonus points because it's a motivation that's personal to them, which means that it ups the emotional stakes and it has potential for some really juicy drama. Good job, Hoyoverse, you did the bare minimum. The problem is that none of the antagonists in Zenless are proper antagonists to Bell and Wise. Bringer was more for Miyabi and Zhuyuan, Lady De Winter was for Astra, Ravenlock for Hugo, Isolde for Magus and Orphe. Also look at Sarah. The proxy had, I think, one conversation with Sarah from both season 1 and 2. And it wasn't a deep or interesting conversation, it was just Sarah being unapologetically evil, and the proxy going, evil is bad. The lack of complexity makes a weak villain, and a weak villain makes for a bad story. The way that Zenless uses antagonists is in a Monster of the Week format. It's a popular format that was used by Sailor Moon, Power Rangers, and all kinds of iconic shows. So the format itself is not the problem. The problem is how Zenless uses this format. With those shows previously mentioned, it works because they have the same cast of characters and the drama isn't just from the Monster of the Week, it also comes from the inner group dynamics. It's interesting to see how these characters' relationships get explored in the story. The problem is that Zenless as a gacha game, by nature, means that the cast is consistently rotating, which means we have to introduce the characters, learn their backstory, solve their personal problem. It's the same format every patch, and because we don't stick with a core cast, we don't have time to develop these connections even further. There's a high level of variance because if the audience doesn't like the new characters, then the audience is less invested. It also means that Bell and Wise are less interesting because they're not being challenged. In a longer form story like a shonen or gacha game, there's going to be a large cast of characters and multiple antagonists. Having multiple antagonists can be a good thing because we can see the unique ways that the protagonist deals with them. Bell and Wise are always going to be in the story. The antagonist should challenge them in some way. However, because there's no long-term antagonist to go against, it means that there's nobody that can challenge them on a deeper level, which makes the conflict feel shallow. Shallow conflict is a boring story. The antagonists we've had so far are ethereals and hollows, the creator and the Exaltists. We also have tops. I'm also going to include PubSec because in season 1 they were an antagonistic force. I'm going to talk about all the antagonists we've had so far and why they don't work. The hollows and ethereals are still one of the most interesting parts of Zenless' world. They're at their best when used to expand Zenless' world building because they're this force of nature that the characters have to deal with. When used properly, Hollows are one of the most terrifying forces in the game. The Hollows are an imminent threat, they're slowly consuming the world, and it almost feels like an inevitability if it wasn't for the collective willpower of the people. In the early chapters of Season 1, Hollows felt dangerous. There was a sense of urgency when we needed to find Billy and Ambi in the prologue, and when our sibling got stuck in one. Even when the proxy got stuck in the Hollow of Miyabi, there was a sense of danger. There are two reasons why Hollows don't feel as dangerous. The first one is obvious. Bell and Wise are no longer in danger when they stay in a Hollow for too long. One of the biggest mistakes that Zenless made was making the proxies too strong too quickly. We went from passing out to not having any issues at all in 15 minutes, because that's how long it took to get that upgrade. Had the writers have Bell and Wise slowly gain resistances to the Hollow, they could have explored them, but there would still be a sense of urgency. The biggest issue with the proxies in Season 2 was that a lot of their development was not earned, which the more I talk about, the more I want to make a breakdown of their writing as protagonists. The other problem is that we just got used to the Hollows. At this point, we visited the Hollows so many times and haven't had any problems. It's basically impossible for Bell and Wise to get lost. They're just that good. Also, none of the agents ever feel like they're at risk for being in a Hollow for too long. The threat of Hollow expansion is the best way to still make Hollows feel dangerous. This is also why ethereals no longer feel threatening. When we first met the Dead End Butcher, it was something that we haven't seen before. It was bigger and more dangerous than any ethereal we've met, and it was treated like a big deal. That's why when Bell and Wise use the train to defeat it, it feels satisfying. They just couldn't brute force it. They had to be clever and show off their intelligence. By this point, we've fought so many high-level ethereals that it's hard to imagine one that would be an actual threat. On top of that, most ethereals are beaten by just hitting them harder. Faith End doesn't really play a part in defeating them. Now, there were sacrifices, which were a special class of ethereal that could exist outside the Hollows, but that kinda went nowhere. The best we got was that cutscene in Season 2, but Yishuan was there, so it ended up not being a problem at all. Remember, this sacrifice plot was being set up since Season 1. There was a lot of setup and anticipation for something that got handled off screen. Something that also bugs me about Zenless is that they haven't had more quests with Rei where we got introduced to Nineveh and Geppetto. These were ethereals that felt like true dangers and actually added to the world building. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten more quests like that in a while. But enough about ethereals, we have to move on and talk about PubSec. I consider PubSec antagonists because proxy work is illegal. The reason that Bell and Wise aren't official Hollow investigators is because they want to avoid a background check, since that would lead to the truth that they were disciples of the guilty.
We had to start out as proxies because we couldn't risk a background check from any official agencies. We're working hard to get money and intel. In the past, the authorities turned a blind eye when it came to proxies. But recently, things have been becoming increasingly difficult.
Now, the lore reason why proxy work is illegal is that they enable Hollow Raiders to go in Hollows. This means that Hollows are given more material to feed on and can cause it to expand. We actually saw this happen in the Golden Week event in 1.1. Rookie Hollow Raiders had rushed inside the Hollow and triggered a warehouse full of AI defense weapons. These weapons got corrupted and caused the Hollow to become unstable and potentially expand. Bell and Wise ended up stopping it, but that's why their work is illegal. PubSec being an antagonist was interesting because it was a particular situation where the law wasn't unfair. In fact, I would say it was pretty reasonable. This made Bell and Wise's job feel riskier. By working outside the law, it made Bell and Wise more morally gray because their work could cause more harm. Also, if they get caught, it's over for them. Their whole life mission is ruined. That is a high stakes situation. Even the agents that work within the law are at risk. Zenless could have had a situation where Zhiyuan or Miyabi get caught working with them, and they have to deal with the backlash. There's so much potential for drama. Wouldn't it suck if the game introduced a prominent political figure that supported the proxies?
After the upgrade, the HDD system will operate with significantly reduced power consumption, allowing for a substantial boost in your ether aptitude, or rather, a restoration to its original level.
I hate that they made the mayor such an important ally so quickly. The decision to introduce the mayor tells me that the devs didn't want to have any moral questions or big issues with the proxy's work. It feels like there wasn't any tension because if they get caught, they know the mayor and it'll get taken care of. The near removal of PubSec as an antagonistic force feels like a major missed opportunity that could have been cool to see. Let's talk about the Exaltists, starting with Sarah. Sarah was a part of Hand, and at some point she was left to die by one of the Void Hunters. In a vacuum, this is great, except they did the same origin story multiple times. Trigger, Isolde, Grim Vulture, and Magus are all elite soldiers that experience tragedy because of corruption from the higher ups. Having multiple characters with a similar story isn't a bad thing. It could have been used to point at a systematic problem with New Eridu's leadership, but it was only presented as a few corrupt individuals and not a wider problem. The major problem with Sarah's motivation is that it's completely wasted because when we learn her origin, she's then merged with the creator. Her origin feels like something that devs put because they wanted easy sympathy points and make it look like she was a tragic character without putting any of the work to make her feel like a tragic character. If they wanted to make her a good sympathetic villain, then we need more moments where she shows vulnerability. It could have been interesting to see her talk about her old team or show that there's more to her than just being a manipulator, because most of the time she goes all according to plan and runs away. If you were to remove the scene with her backstory, nothing substantial about the story would change. The other problem with Sarah's motivation compared to the others is that there's nobody to connect with. Grim Vulture had Trigger and Isolde had Magus and Orphe. With Sarah, there's nobody to parallel with. We don't see Sarah talking to Isolde about her past. They are both disillusioned soldiers that were betrayed. They could have had interesting dialogue between them. Miyabi is another character that could have had an interesting dynamic with Sarah because they were both in hand. I went back to that scene with Miyabi in the car, and Sarah doesn't say anything except spout off exposition. Miyabi is one of the characters that could challenge Sarah's beliefs. Knowing what we know about Sarah, there should have been something personal about Sarah's attitude towards Miyabi. It could be discussed because Miyabi represents the party that betrayed her, or it could be pity from Sarah's perspective because she knows the truth about the world and Miyabi is just naive. But we don't get this ideological clash between characters. This leads me to believe that the characters really didn't know what Sarah's character was until season 2, because if the devs did, then that scene with Miyabi should have had more impact and weight to it. Sarah was like Miyabi in some ways before she joined the Exaltists. Sarah is an antagonist with cool moments, but that's not interesting in the story. Now, Bringer has a similar motivation to Sarah. He sacrificed himself to save others, and as he was dying, the creator appeared to him. Earlier I mentioned how Bringer is more of an antagonist to Zhuyuan and Miyabi and not Phaethon. Bringer's connection to Zhuyuan is obvious. He saved her when she was younger, and she looks up to him. With Miyabi, Bringer represents everything she fights against. Section 6's whole motto is that they eradicate all evil and that they decide who's evil. Miyabi prefers to rely on her own judgment. We saw this when she went against Topps' plan to blow up a pillar to protect their own assets. Bringer is that corruption. He's an influential figure that uses the forces of justice for his own gain. As the first big antagonist, I actually don't have many problems with Bringer. He kind of works. He's a good introduction to the Exaltists. He does a good job at showing us how the Exaltists are able to hide in the highest positions of power and how they are used to work from the shadows. Everything that happens in the early chapters were planned by Bringer and Sarah. He feels like a threat because he was able to isolate Miyabi by outsmarting Section 6. Bringer is also the first person that we see take the sacrifice serum. When he turns into an ethereal, it is one of the coolest moments in season 1. It generally felt that without Miyabi, the agents were in danger. The biggest problem with Bringer is that he lacks depth. He's a very simple antagonist, which is why he's memorable, but really nothing to write home about. By building up Bringer as a major threat, it does make his defeat more satisfying. Now, believe it or not, I actually don't have many problems with Isolde. She has an interesting motivation, and seeing her get revenge was cool. She works because she's a foil to Magus and is a catalyst to Magus' arc. But with how stuffed season 2 was with the creator and with Sarah, my issue with Isolde really has to do with how the Exaltists were used in general. So, the Exaltists are obsessed with the creator and want to refine humanity by turning people into ethereals. The idea of the Exaltists is really good because the concept of having people obsessed with embracing the hollows instead of fighting them is perfect for this world. Their beliefs completely go against humanity's undying willpower against the hollows. The issue is that their writing is all over the place. Throughout the story, we stop every single one of their plans, but it doesn't really feel like a cohesive plan. It's just scheme after scheme without any real rhyme or reason. It gets even worse when Isolde dies and they just crumble. They've lost leaders in the past before and have kept going, but apparently they're just done now. They had a lot of buildup and were presented as this secret society, but we beat them so easily, I don't even think they had any meaningful consequences to New Eridu. We beat them and that's that. The only points I'll give is that they are directly connected to Carol Arna, but we still don't know anything else, which is a shame because it feels like Bell and Wise haven't gotten any closer to their goal. Now, Topps will have a bigger role in season 3, so I'm reserving judgment for them. What we do know about Topps is that they aim to control through financial power, which is basically the most realistic goal out of all the other antagonists in Zenless. Basically, just think about Google or Samsung and you get the idea. Anyways, there's one more antagonist I want to talk about, and that's Yokai. Now, I know I'm sounding pessimistic, but there is a silver lining. With the introduction to Yokai, we do have an antagonist that poses a threat. That hack on Fairy was one of the best scenes in season 2. we've never seen a force that can go toe to toe with a proxy and fairy, so we immediately establish how strong Yokai is. Yokai is going to play a big role in season 3, and this has me excited. I want to know what they do with this character and how they develop it, because if they can make Yokai work as an antagonist, then that would be a good sign for Zenless' writing in the future. So I'm going to be paying close attention to them and Tops. So just to recap, Zenless' antagonists feel underwhelming because they're mostly one-off antagonists that only exist for the newest characters. The villains that do stick around don't have well-developed motivations or are defeated too easily. The main point is that in order to have an interesting story, you need to have an interesting antagonist, and Zenless has been struggling to find one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time. It might be a week, it might be a year.